Sarah walked into the airport with a slow but steady gait. The incessant announcements over the PA system blended with the rolling hum of luggage wheels and the soft buzz of conversations from the crowd. Despite the bustling atmosphere, curious eyes quickly turned toward her. A middle-aged black woman carrying a small bag and exuding a confident air, she didn't resemble the typical passengers seen at this international airport. She stopped at the check-in counter, handing over her ticket and identification to the staff member. The young woman behind the counter glanced at Sarah, her expression betraying a hint of doubt. A brief hesitation flashed across her face as she inspected the ticket. "Ma'am, this is a business-class ticket." "Are you certain this is your flight?" the staff member asked, her tone polite but tinged with skepticism. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her voice calm. "I'm certain. This is my flight." The attendant looked down at her computer, checking again with pursed lips, as though searching for a justifiable reason to deny her. "I'm sorry, but I need a moment to verify. It's not common for us to encounter situations like this." Sarah held her gaze steady, saying nothing further. Behind her, murmurs began to ripple through the line. A voice spoke loud enough for Sarah to hear, laced with condescension. "Must have bought the wrong ticket or ended up in the wrong class." Sarah didn't turn, but she tightened her grip on her bag. Her heart raced slightly, but her expression remained composed. After a moment, the staff member returned her documents with a forced smile. "Everything checks out, ma'am. Have a pleasant flight." Sarah gave a small nod and moved on without another word. Proceeding to the security checkpoint, she placed her belongings on the conveyor belt as instructed by a tall male officer. His scrutinizing gaze unsettled her. After passing through the scanner, the officer gestured for her to stop. "Ma'am, we'll need to open your bag for additional inspection." "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. "It's just a routine check," the officer replied, though his demeanor revealed an undercurrent of mistrust. Sarah watched as the security officers opened her suitcase, inspecting every compartment and every personal item with meticulous care. Passers-by glanced at her, whispering amongst themselves. A young woman stopped, folding her arms across her chest. "How did she even get through this checkpoint?" she said to the person beside her. Sarah heard the remark but chose not to respond. After a while, the security officer closed her suitcase, his expression awkward as he failed to find anything suspicious. "Everything is fine. You may proceed," he said, his tone lowered, as though attempting to hide his embarrassment. Sarah picked up her suitcase, straightened her back, and walked away without looking back. Each of her steps seemed to leave a reverberation that quieted the security checkpoint area. Yet deep inside, she felt the all-too-familiar weight of prejudice, a shadow that had followed her from her youth to this very moment. She moved to the boarding area and chose an empty seat near a window. Opening her bag, she pulled out a small book, hoping to read and distract herself from the curious gazes around her. But the sensation of being watched was inescapable. A young couple sitting a few rows away whispered to each other while stealing glances at her. "Bold, isn't it? Buying a business-class ticket but looking nothing like it," the man muttered. "Probably a free ticket or a gift from someone," the woman added, her tone laced with sarcasm. Sarah pretended not to hear. She opened the book, but the words on the page blurred into meaninglessness. Memories of being misjudged solely for her skin color came flooding back. This time, however, Sarah resolved not to let their words disturb her. She exhaled softly, turning to the next page and ignoring the chatter around her. When the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Sarah closed her book and got ready. She stood, grabbed her suitcase, and walked toward the boarding gate. Her journey continued, though she had no way of knowing that the prejudices she faced today were just the beginning and the trials ahead would test her patience and dignity in ways no one could predict. If you empathize with the pressures Sarah faces from judgmental glances and hurtful words, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to join us on this emotional journey. Your support inspires us to tell more meaningful stories. Stay tuned to see how Sarah confronts the challenges ahead. Sarah stepped onto the plane, the business-class cabin unfolding before her in all its refined luxury: plush leather seats, ample legroom, and soft lighting reflecting off gleaming metallic surfaces. Yet, the elegance couldn't mask the peculiar atmosphere that her arrival seemed to create. Conversations gradually died down, and the passengers' collective gazes shifted toward her. Sarah was unfazed, but the heavy silence made her acutely aware of every inquisitive look and every hushed whisper. She glanced at her ticket and walked toward her assigned seat. A tall flight attendant, impeccably dressed in a neat uniform, quickly approached her. Though she wore a smile, Sarah noticed the uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Hello, ma'am. Are you looking for your seat? Let me check it for you," the attendant offered, her tone polite but tinged with formality. "That won't be necessary," Sarah replied, holding up her ticket. "This is my seat." The attendant glanced at the ticket, her gaze lingering a second too long. She smiled again, but it was strained, unable to conceal the doubt in her demeanor. "Of course. Please have a seat." Sarah nodded slightly and reached for the overhead compartment to stow her suitcase. As she lifted it, the flight attendant stepped forward hastily. "Let me help you with that. There's no need to strain yourself," she said softly, as though reassuring someone incapable of the task. Sarah turned to her, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "Thank you, but I've got it." With a firm and deliberate motion, Sarah hoisted the suitcase herself, leaving the attendant to awkwardly retreat. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, some smirking as though witnessing an amusing spectacle. Sarah settled into her seat, adjusted her handbag, and tried to focus on the book in her hands. But the murmurs from the seats behind her were impossible to ignore. Is she really sitting in business class? Maybe there's been some mistake? Look at her. Who'd imagine she could afford a seat here? Probably a free ticket, or someone else paid for it. Sarah didn't turn around, but she could feel the stares burning into her back. Each word felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing her skin. She had learned to endure prejudice with patience since she was young, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. A young woman passing by stopped near Sarah's seat, her smile courteous but her tone pointed. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you sure this is your seat? I don't mean to bother you, but I think you might be mistaken." Sarah raised her gaze, locking eyes with the woman, her expression steady and unwavering. "I'm certain this is my seat. Thank you for your concern." The woman flushed, nodded quickly, and walked away. Sarah sighed softly, her hands tightening around the book she held, trying to maintain her composure. As the flight prepared for takeoff, the flight attendants began serving drinks. When it was Sarah's turn, the lead flight attendant returned, but this time, her smile had vanished entirely. "Apologies, ma'am, but we're currently busy serving other passengers. Can you wait a little longer?" she asked. Sarah glanced around and noticed that everyone else had already been served. She replied gently, "I just need a glass of water. That shouldn't take long." The flight attendant raised her eyebrows and exhaled sharply, as though being asked to do something outside her duties. "I'll bring your water after I've finished serving the other passengers." Sarah could hear the mockery in her tone, but she chose not to react. She simply nodded quietly. Nearby, a man whispered to his companion, "Does she really think she's VIP? She doesn't fit in at all." When Sarah finally received her glass of water, the attendant placed it on her table roughly, spilling some onto the surface. "Here's your water," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I hope you're satisfied." Sarah looked up, her eyes no longer soft. "I hope this service isn't reflective of this airline's standards." Her remark made the attendant pause, but she quickly regained her composure, her tone defiant. "We do our best to serve all passengers, ma'am." An older woman seated nearby couldn't hold back any longer and spoke up, her voice firm. "This is shameful. She hasn't done anything wrong. Why are you treating her this way?" Her words brought a hush to the cabin. Some passengers began nodding in agreement, while others turned away, unwilling to involve themselves in the situation. Sarah turned to the older woman and offered a small, grateful smile. But she said nothing further, instead closing her eyes and reminding herself to stay calm. The prejudiced remarks echoed in her mind, but Sarah knew her life had proven one undeniable truth: actions and resilience speak louder than any hateful words. The flight continued, though the atmosphere remained heavy. These minor conflicts were just the beginning. Sarah could feel that something much larger awaited her. How do you feel about the discrimination Sarah faced on the plane? What would you do in her position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share to spread the message of fairness and kindness. We need your support to join us on this journey. Sarah tried to close her eyes, focusing on her breathing to dispel the negative emotions from the unjust treatment she had just experienced. But only a few minutes passed before a sudden, violent jolt made her eyes snap open. The seatbelt sign above her flashed, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain calm." Around her, passengers began to stir nervously. The clicks of seatbelts being fastened, rapid breathing, and hushed prayers created an oppressive atmosphere. Sarah quietly checked her seatbelt, her eyes instinctively scanning the cabin, a reflex honed from her years in the military. When the plane shook violently again, a faint groan from the left caught Sarah's attention. She turned her head to see an elderly man, Henry Williams, clutching his chest, his face pale and drenched with sweat. The woman seated next to him panicked, crying out, "Someone please help. He can't breathe." The lead flight attendant rushed over, but the uncertainty in her eyes was evident. She crouched next to Henry, her hands trembling as she attempted to assess his condition. "Does anyone know first aid? We need a doctor, please," she called out, her gaze darting desperately around the cabin. There was no response. The cabin seemed frozen, with passengers exchanging helpless and anxious looks. Sarah unfastened her seatbelt and stood up. Her steps were steady despite the turbulence. "Let me take a look," Sarah said, her voice calm and authoritative. The flight attendant's eyes widened in surprise and she hesitated. Are you sure? This could be serious. If you can't handle it, then step aside." "I know what I'm doing," Sarah replied firmly, her tone commanding enough to make the attendant step back. Sarah knelt beside Henry and placed her fingers on his neck to check his pulse. His heartbeat was faint, and his breathing was shallow and erratic. She quickly addressed the panicked woman beside him. "Does he have a history of heart problems? Is he carrying any medication?" The woman, trembling, nodded and handed Sarah a small bottle. "Nitroglycerin. Here, take this." Sarah opened the bottle, removed a pill, and carefully placed it under Henry's tongue. She turned to the lead flight attendant with unwavering focus. "I need an oxygen tank right now. And if you have one, bring the defibrillator as well." The flight attendant hurried toward the medical supply cabinet while Sarah continued checking on Henry. She gently tilted his head back to open his airway and used a cloth to wipe the sweat from his brow. A passenger nearby whispered, "Is she a doctor?" "She doesn't look like one," another replied. "Who cares? As long as she knows how to help." When the flight attendant returned with the oxygen tank, Sarah affixed the mask to Henry's face and monitored his breathing. He began to breathe more steadily, though he was still weak. Sarah turned back to the attendant. "Where's the defibrillator?" The flight attendant stammered, We don't have a defibrillator on this flight." Sarah pressed her lips tightly together, keeping her emotions in check. "All right, at least he's stable for now. Keep monitoring him closely." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as Henry began to regain consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, and his breathing grew stronger with the aid of the oxygen. His wife clutched Sarah's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. Thank you so much. You saved his life." Sarah gave a slight nod, her eyes reflecting relief, though her expression remained calm. "I just did what needed to be done. But once we land, he'll need to go to the hospital immediately." Passengers began murmuring again, but this time it wasn't whispers of doubt or ridicule. Instead, their eyes were filled with admiration and respect. The lead flight attendant stood nearby, silent. She looked at Sarah, her expression a mix of astonishment and remorse. After a moment, she spoke hesitantly. Are you a doctor?" I'm sorry for what happened earlier. I didn't think that." Sarah met her gaze, her eyes sharp but devoid of anger. "No, I'm not a doctor. I'm a veteran and a former combat medic. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that we just saved a life." The flight attendant bowed her head, shame washing over her. Her earlier behavior now seemed petty and unjustifiable in the light of what had just transpired, as the plane finally cleared the turbulence and stabilized. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just experienced an emergency situation. Thanks to the courageous actions of a passenger, Mr. Henry Williams received timely care. On behalf of the entire crew, I extend our deepest gratitude." Sarah returned to her seat quietly, but this time she could feel the shift in the air around her. The eyes that once scrutinized her now held genuine respect. A young woman approached her, smiling warmly. "Thank you. You did something not everyone would have the courage to do. We're so fortunate to have had you here today." Sarah gave a small nod, her gaze turning toward the window where white clouds drifted past. But within her, a wave of emotion swelled not from the praise but from knowing she had changed how people saw her, and more importantly, what she represented. The plane had cleared the turbulence, and the atmosphere in the cabin gradually settled. Passengers remained in their seats, many still discussing the events that had just transpired. Sarah leaned back in her seat, her eyes closed, but she could feel the weight of the passengers' gazes no longer filled with scrutiny or mockery, but with respect and gratitude. The cockpit door opened, and the captain, a middle-aged man in a pristine uniform, stepped into the cabin. He glanced around before heading straight to where Sarah sat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice warm and authoritative. "On behalf of the entire crew, I want to express our sincere gratitude. Your actions not only saved a passenger's life but brought stability to everyone on this flight." Sarah looked at him and responded softly, "I just did what needed to be done." But the captain's gaze lingered on her face, a flicker of recognition crossing his expression. "Are you Sarah Thompson?" he asked, his tone tinged with disbelief. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Yes, that's me. How do you know?" The captain hesitated for a moment before his eyes lit up with both joy and admiration. "My father served with you in the military. He often spoke of a courageous and skilled combat medic, a woman who saved countless lives on the battlefield. I never imagined I'd meet you under these circumstances." Sarah gave a faint smile, her eyes warm. "Your father was an extraordinary man. He inspired everyone with his optimism, even in the harshest of times." Nearby, the lead flight attendant seemed stunned by what she was hearing. The stories of Sarah, a battlefield medic who had saved dozens of comrades under fire, were no longer distant legends. The woman she had once looked down upon, judged through a lens of prejudice, now stood revealed as someone with unparalleled bravery and resilience. Overcome with emotion, the flight attendant stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Ma'am, I don't even know what to say. I truly apologize for how I treated you earlier. I didn't realize." Sarah turned to her, her gaze gentle but firm. "Don't apologize to me. But remember this: never judge someone based on their appearance or background. Everyone has their own story, and what matters most is how we treat each other." Those words felt like a profound lesson, prompting the flight attendant to bow her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I understand. I'll remember this forever." The passengers who overheard the conversation began murmuring among themselves. Some looked embarrassed, recalling the harsh judgments they had made earlier. A middle-aged man seated nearby stood and walked over to Sarah. "I owe you an apology, ma'am. I misjudged you entirely. What you've done today is a powerful lesson for me." Sarah gave him a gentle nod, saying nothing. But her eyes, filled with forgiveness, seemed to lighten the man's guilt. From a row ahead, a young woman turned to her companion and whispered, "I can't believe it. Someone like her had to endure the looks we gave her." Sarah quietly returned to her seat, feeling the silent respect emanating from those around her. The plane continued its journey in peace, but the echoes of the recent events lingered in the cabin. The gazes that had once been filled with scrutiny were now full of genuine admiration. A young girl from the row behind approached, holding a small piece of paper. She smiled and spoke in a sweet, innocent voice. "You're amazing. I want to grow up to be as strong as you." Sarah took the paper from the girl and saw a drawing of her helping Mr. Henry. A true smile spread across Sarah's face. "Thank you, sweetheart. You'll do it, as long as you always believe in yourself." Sarah sat still, gazing out the window as white clouds drifted by. Her thoughts wandered to her days on the battlefield, where life was measured in seconds. Those years had not only taught her how to save lives but also how to confront prejudice and injustice. Though she no longer wore a uniform, that fighting spirit remained a part of her, an inseparable piece of who she was. She thought about the upcoming recognition ceremony. But what felt like the greatest honor to her wasn't the medals she would receive, but the way the eyes around her had changed from judgment to respect. That was her true victory. The truth had been revealed, and Sarah Thompson had proven that a person's worth lies not in others' judgments but in their actions. If you find this story meaningful, leave a heart and hit subscribe to support us as we bring more inspiring stories your way. Stay tuned for the moment of Sarah's recognition in the next chapter. The plane landed peacefully, and passengers began to rise, gathering their belongings and making their way off the aircraft. Sarah slowly packed up her things, noticing one last glance from the lead flight attendant, who bowed her head slightly and softly said, "Have a wonderful day, ma'am, and thank you for everything." Sarah gave a small nod, saying nothing. As she stepped off the plane and descended the stairs, she saw a group of people waiting in the distance, holding banners and flags. A man in a military uniform approached her, his face beaming. "Sarah Thompson, we've been waiting for you," he said, his voice booming with enthusiasm. Sarah was surprised. She hadn't expected such a welcome. The man stepped closer and saluted her crisply. "I'm Colonel Harris. We have the honor of escorting you to today's ceremony." Sarah smiled gently, returning the salute. "This is an incredible honor. But I'm just an ordinary soldier." Harris shook his head. "No, ma'am. You're a legend." The hall where the ceremony was being held was decorated with great reverence, featuring photos and banners paying tribute to heroes who had served their country. As Sarah entered, everyone rose to their feet, applauding thunderously. She felt a mix of familiarity and strangeness, a respect she had rarely experienced in her life. Sarah made her way to the seat reserved for her, but before she could sit down, a familiar voice echoed from the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we are honored to welcome someone whose name is synonymous with courage and sacrifice, Colonel Sarah Thompson." Sarah looked up to see General Miller, her former superior officer in the military, standing on the stage. He invited her to join him, his gaze full of pride. Sarah stepped onto the stage to the sound of prolonged applause. She looked out at the crowd and saw familiar faces, old comrades, their families, and young hopefuls with bright eyes. Taking the microphone, her voice trembled at first but quickly grew steady and strong. "Thank you for this honor. But today I don't want to talk about myself. I want to talk about the people who helped me stand here." She paused, her eyes scanning the audience. "My comrades who fought and sacrificed alongside me, my family who supported me even when I was often absent, and all the people out there who silently endure and fight against the prejudices and injustices we sometimes fail to see." A profound silence fell over the hall, broken only by the sound of her voice. "I've learned that the battlefield is not just the ground we fight on. It's also found in how we treat one another, in our looks, in our words. And today, I want to thank not only those who gave me the strength to stand here, but also those who once judged me, because they helped me understand that respect is earned through actions, not titles." When Sarah finished, the applause erupted again, louder and longer than before. But what moved her most were the expressions in the audience, no longer filled with judgment, only with genuine respect and admiration. Among the crowd, a young woman, the lead flight attendant from the earlier flight, sat quietly, tears streaming down her face. She had followed Sarah's journey in silence, and now the weight of her earlier behavior felt heavier than ever.